out today, and happy Juneteenth.
Yeah.
So now we have this national holiday, and it's even greater that we're doing this today. This was actually scheduled for last year, and then the user response is that, but 2020. So, but 2020. So now we're actually doing it on an even more meaningful day. So my name is Ophelia Chambliss. I am an artist, a community historian, a commissioner for the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission, adjunct professor. I wear many hats. But for the last 2.5 years or so, I have been doing interviews with York's Black residents, trying to uncover and discover, a lot of this history, which then kind of came together in this timeline. So I'm going to tell you how this whole process started, what I discovered, why it's important, and then where we're going to go from here. So it started as, when I came to York, I was brought here for a job. I was the vice president of publishing services. What's my former boss who's here? And the position didn't quite work out, but that's okay. I found York extremely interesting, and I decided to stay in the area. And as an artist, one of my very first exhibits, my style was a very cubist, colorful style, and I overheard these two women at this exhibit say, gee, her work isn't quite black enough. I'm like, well, what does that mean? So it really got me to thinking about, well, what is black art? Is it the ethnicity of the artist, or is it the cultural content of the art? So I started exploring that. And then in the process, some other things were happening here in York, in reference to its history and its background, that really got me focusing on the issue of race in York's black citizens. So then I started doing this whole series of paintings, which became an exhibit called Casting Shadows, where I wanted to really explore not just what happened in 68, 69 with the race riots, but fill in the gaps to all the wonderful things that happened in between. And I did this from the position of the West African folktale that says the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until the lion has his own storyteller. So I wanted to kind of put on the hat of being that storyteller to tell York's black history from that cultural lens and that point of view. So some of the earlier pieces were, this one is kind of like a cultural art nouveau. So taking York's black history, if you see the image in the middle, and then reframing it in a different context, being able to tell this story from a different point of view. So this isn't just some old black couple on their way to church. This is grandparents. This is parents. This is the foundation of a family. This is a representation of a community. This is a community pride. So reframing and changing the narrative about what we see in these historical images. So one of the very early things that I found in reference to black folks coming to York is in 1827, there were 2 wagon loads of manumitted slaves. So a manumitted slave is where someone was enslaved in the South, and then they were set free. They were kind of given papers to say, you're free, go. And this was even prior to emancipation. There was a Quaker group in Virginia that manumitted this group of individuals, sent them here to a Quaker group in York, and said, set them up, find them a place to stay. So that's kind of where the timeline starts. So then the timeline progresses all the way around the room, and believe me, there are a lot of things missing from this timeline because we just didn't have the space to put everything in. But this is also the beginning, or just the beginning, of us being able to enrich this whole story. There were, in doing my research, through newspaper articles, national newspaper articles, local newspaper articles, and then some, scattered images of individuals, being able to find out about some of these people, and what they did. This is Zach Shaw, and it was a pretty decent photograph of him, but he was known around town. They very often referred to them as characters. He wore a really colorful coat. It was probably a patchwork coat made from different fabrics that he had to put together, or an old quilt that was made into a coat. And he sold peanuts in the square. So very often these individuals came to York and they had to kind of make a way out of no way. So these were the early entrepreneurs. They had to not find jobs, but make jobs for themselves. One of my favorite individuals is Hester Oliver. So she was described as the matriarch of this group. She was the one who, helped find people places to stay. She, was known around York for baking cakes and pies, and through that money she was able to say, you go stay over here, here's a place for you to stay. But she was in charge of this group. The only available photograph of her is, of this old woman sitting, in this chair with this gingham dress. But that doesn't tell the whole story of who Hester Oliver was. So according to their articles and the research that I've done, they describe her as a woman of, what do they call her, of good stature. So she was about 6 feet tall, which is pretty significant for that time. They also said that she was a matriarch of this group, and she made a living by baking these cakes and pies, and that she could read. So this image on the left doesn't tell you all of that about Hester Oliver. So I painted this image, and my background, my major is in communication theory, media discourse analysis, and rhetoric. So as an artist, using visual rhetoric, I wanted to paint an image that really spoke to who she was and what she represented, because that's a part of the story and the history that has more value than just this photograph. So I painted her standing to give some sense of her stature. She's holding a book to give an indication that she could read. There are cakes and pies cooling on the rack beside her, and there's a young lady behind her, to give this indication that, she was in charge of individuals. As I mentioned, the West African folktale about, the tale of the hunt. It's important that, for me as an artist to be able to tell these stories, and it's important for other artists to tell these stories. Because one of the key things to, especially some of the older images, is we don't have positive representation of what African Americans have done historically and throughout time, because no one's out there taking positive pictures, and very often these things were done by artists. So, in this image alone, the image on the right depicts, they would Negroes out in the field, they would describe them as, jumping around and doing this jig and making no sense at all, but not understanding that there's a potential that there was some cultural dances. These were part of a ritual of some sort that was brought from the motherland, but that was still a deep part of their culture. In many cases, it was how they communicated. Because when Africans were brought over, they were in mixed groups of tribes, so they probably did not speak the same language. So the only thing they might have had was dance and music to some degree. So for a lot of them, it was a way of communicating, but that's how they kind of took the power away from them, by splitting them up, in different tribes and groups. As opposed to the way an African-American artist from nearly the same period, Henry Ossawa Tanner, would have painted an interaction with a violin in a very different and a more loving way. So I'm always encouraging artists to tell these stories that we can't see, through research and through articles, because we're going to be able to tell a different story. And when you're telling it from, a different cultural lens, it becomes a more powerful story. There are stories of Squire Braxton, who his real name was Charles Granger. So it's another problem with a lot of the research is people's names were changed, or no one took the time to spell their name properly. They probably called him Squire Braxton because, he walks around acting like he knows something or he's in charge of something. So it was a way of making fun of him, but his real name was Charles Granger. He had 2 other brothers who came along with him on this wagon load. A lot of the individuals stayed here in York, and some moved out to Fairview Township. But Squire Braxton actually owned property on the Commons, and there's actually a deed here on file with the History Center, where I think it's Michael Miller, who got the property from William Penn, deeded the property to Squire Braxton. Now, it's not in his official name, but he actually owned property. There's an actual deed of record. I did find a little hint of something to say what happened to that property, or is it still his property? But one of the stories indicated that at some point when they decided to do the York Fair in this space, and he really resisted that. He wanted, this is my land, you can't do this. But they couldn't find what they called the golden key. So they couldn't find this deed to say that it was officially his, even though he resisted. They eventually convinced him, let us use this for the fairgrounds and we'll give you free tickets to the fair. So at some point, he lost control of the land. This is another one of the images that I'm still kind of in debate about, because the way history typically is kept, or the way we're told how to keep archives, it's a very, I don't want to say it's biased, but by default, sometimes we don't tell the whole story, because the way history is told, we need to be able to prove it, we need to have dates, we need to have names, we need to be able to have provenance, where did it come from? But with a lot of African American history, we don't have that. So should we not tell the story? Should we not talk about it because we don't have this trail? No, that is not the case. So in some cases, we have to find another way, whether it's through oral history or by piecing things together. There might have been a similar story in another place, that we can puzzle together from this newspaper article and that newspaper article to tell a more comprehensive story. But the story should not go untold simply because we don't have a photograph or an image to represent it. So this image, Louis Miller image, which they said he was between here and Newark quite often, is an image of a wedding festival. And one of the articles that I read, and a lot of it was from Squire Braxton's account of Hester Oliver's daughter's wedding, which was the largest event that she called it her society that they had here. So it was probably one of the first weddings. It was the largest social event. They talked about it being a party that went on all night long. They dressed in their finest dress, and they had food, and it was really a huge celebration. So I like to think of this as being Hester's daughter's wedding, because it's very significant. It's somewhere near that time frame, even though it indicates that he drew this while he was in Lynchburg, Virginia. But just because we don't have an image of this wedding, that story needs to be told, even though a lot of it was from Squire Braxton's account, some other stories that were in the newspaper at that time. An additional challenge to doing this kind of research, as I mentioned, people's names were changed throughout a lot of the research. Hester was referred to as Hester. Esther, her name was spelled different ways. She was referred to as Black Hester in some cases. When you're doing the research and digging into archives, historically, depending on what decade you're in, Black folks were referred to as different things. Sometimes you're looking for references to nigger, Negro, Black, African American, back to Black again. So at some point, we need to hashtag these things and pull them all together where they're cross-referenced, so we can really put things together. And I've been working with the History Center over these couple of years, trying to really pull this stuff together, taking a look at some of the things that they have in their archives and adding names to it and making sense of it, because a lot of the people who were connected to these things still live here. A lot of people have lived here in York County for multiple generations, so there's no reason not to be able to put this stuff together. For example, the Keenhill family, which are also the Dorms and a few other names, there are 5 generations of them here. So people still exist that we can do this and get these stories. I have also been conducting interviews with as many people as possible, which isn't easy to do, to get people to let you into their homes, have these very intimate conversations. First you have to get past the hard stuff, because people always want to talk about, the 68, 69 riots, but I want to hear more. I want to go deeper. I want to hear more about, the things you remember that were good things that are going to add to this fabric of what this is. People always talk about William Goodrich, the barbershop and the Underground Railroad, and we really glorify that story. But when I first got here, you hear about William Goodrich, you used to think that he was the only Black man in town. But now we know that there was all these other individuals working and doing things. So we need to tell more of that story instead of just select pieces. This exhibit is called the Essential Pieces because we're filling in a lot of those gaps. While William Goodrich was, pretty cool, he had this house, he had this kind of Underground Railroad stuff, but his sons, Glenn Alvin and William, were pretty interesting as well. I mean, they were photographers in their own right. And even though they might have left York, they participated in the 1900 Paris exhibition of photography at the Chicago Fair with William Dubois and Frederick Douglass. And they were noted as being some of the premier photographers. They were the earlier ones to adopt these processes. And York can claim that they were part of this. 'This. They were a part of the the Reconstruction period, where now photography of African Americans was extremely important, because here's an opportunity now to be pictured in a different light. Here's an opportunity to be depicted in a positive light, because what happened prior to this, the way African Americans were pictured, was in a very derogatory way through the Jim Crow laws. So when you saw images of African Americans, you know, they were extremely negative. They were blackface. They were, you know, the little nigger babies eating the watermelon, being chased by crocodiles. They were the inky soap ad. So it was a part of this country's fabric that's how African Americans were depicted. So it was extremely important to have that image change. And to this day, it's still extremely important. So the booklet, the photo album that Dubois and Douglas put together is available at the Library of Congress, and if you sign up and get on the list and you put on the white gloves, you can, you know, go into this hermetically sealed room, you can actually look at it. Some of the images are online, but some of these images were the images of Glenn Alvin and his brother Wilbur, you know, during this time period. These were the women from Fisk University. Because after emancipation, after now, you know, blacks can be educated, they needed schools to educate the men. So the public school system we have today was started because of the need now to educate all of these black children. So they started the public, you know, the public school system that we have. And then even poor whites in the South, who now didn't have the advantage of this free labor, you know, attended these schools. And then that went on for many, many years, and being taught by, you know, the Fisk University students and all the other people, until then schools became segregated. And they specialized in, you know, a series of images of typical Negro faces, is what the whole series in the album was called. You know, black folks doing everyday things to really kind of change that narrative of how people were pictured. And I'm not sure if you guys know, like, so after emancipation and during the Reconstruction period, we had more African American congressmen and state senators and representatives than this country has ever had since. I mean, it was a phenomenal period. And then the federal government didn't kind of hold up its end of the deal to make people continue to enforce that, and then things went by the wayside. As you go through this timeline, you will even notice peaks of progress and then drop-offs, because historically that's the way it's always happened. It takes a great deal of pressure for things to change, but it's not sustainable. So you'll start off with, you know, emancipation, we get an increase in growth, you know, jobs, people and individuals, and things taper off. Board of Education, you know, Brown versus the Board of Education. We get an increase, it's going to drop off. You get 69 riots, increase, drop off. And that continues to happen. We need to get to the point of building that momentum. So a lot of these images were formal, informal, you know, people just working, eating, sitting in their homes, in their living room. And a lot of these images, unfortunately, have been lost, because we are like one house fire or one estate fire away from losing all these images, because, you know, they're albums, you know, sitting in attics. And, you know, if it's not on their phone, kids aren't keeping those albums anymore, you know. So you can go on eBay right now and look up African American photos, families, gatherings, and you can just buy box loads of them for 40 bucks, because it's not being sustained and maintained. And I'm always encouraging. So even with the History Center, you know, the thing was to get people to save those stories and those images, and, you know, and even working with the trust factor, because nobody's going to take their great-grandma's album of all these wonderful pictures and say, here. So yeah, keep your album, but let us scan them. Let's not lose the stories and the images and the background just because, you know, you don't want to give those things up. We'll scan them, take your photos back home with them, but we have a digital record. We have names to go along with all of these incredible images. So we continue to encourage people to do that. Earlier we were talking about, so now they have this mobile station that, you know, they can go to people and gather these stories. You know, if there's an event, a gathering of Christmas addicts, go there. We've got the scanner. They're training people to do these interviews so that we can gather these oral stories to make them a part of this. Because we should not be at a place where we're constantly saying, you know, I didn't know that. You know, oh, I just found that out. You know, because 2 generations from now, we're going to have young folks going, I did not know there was a Juneteenth celebration. I did not know that that was the first black mayor. I did not. So we need to stop saying, I did not know that. I mean, how many of us saw that movie, you know, Hidden Figures with the mathematicians? You know, everybody thought, oh, that's so wonderful. We did not know that. But somebody knew it. So At what point do we get this as part of the record, as part of this national fabric, that these stories aren't new to us anymore? So I want to talk about the timeline. So this is just a mere portion of what we were able to find and put together, and a lot of things didn't end up here because of just a lack of space. And the idea was to really put things in context so that you can see how things lined up nationally, locally, and with other things to really get a sense of how York fit into this. One of the most important ones, and the key one over there, so in 1929, and I like to talk about this one, so Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Anne Frank, who you guys have heard of Anne Frank's diaries, and Barbara Walters were all born in the same year. The same year. So put that in context. 1929. So we're not talking millions of years ago, because when you see Anne Frank, it's always the same black and white little photo, and it looks like it was 200 years ago. No, the same year. So that just gives you an idea of how relative things are, and that's why a timeline is important, because then you get a sense of so when that was happening, this was happening. So it's not so long ago. When people, say, well, we don't want to talk about enslavement, we don't want to talk about when this happened, that was so long ago. No, that was my grandmother's life ago. It wasn't that long ago. So I think if people kind of get that context and line things up, it will give them a different level of appreciation for things. Another one of my favorite stories was that of Ethel Cowles. She still has family here. One of the newspaper articles, and it's really funny to read some of the things in the newspapers in terms of how they describe people, because again, black folks are always characters. They weren't so much individuals, but characters, and they were colorful and very interesting, like they were like a novelty. But with Ethel Cowles, the newspaper article was so excited about, this black lady is going to be able to work at this factory, because that was a big deal in 1905. And how she came to work in this factory was that the woman she worked for was sick, and she didn't want to lose her job. So she sent Ethel to cover her at work, and then her illness got extended. And so Ethel was doing a good job, and the factory actually liked her there. So they had to vote amongst themselves as to whether or not to allow this black woman to continue to work here. And so that was newsworthy, that, we hired her. We're going to let her work here in earnest, not just to fill in for somebody. So I think that prior to her being actually hired, the woman who she was going to work for actually collected the pay. So it became news and official that, Ethel, you can stay here and work, and actually we're going to pay you this time. So it's interesting to find that. And as I mentioned before, when you're looking at these articles and stories, you have to dig deep, because we found Ethel's name spelled in multiple different ways. It was Ethel, it was Ethel, it was Cowles with 2 L's, because there wasn't a lot of attention paid to that. And then again, you have to look under the different categories. What decade was it? What year was it? To find out how they were referred to. So again, at some point, we're going to link all those things together. Looking at Aquila Wilson, a decorated United States colored troop soldier, and the significance he played. And he still has family here in York. And one of the important things about, so this is one of the paintings from the Casting Shadows series. And the most important thing about this painting is he was, as a decorated soldier, he had these medals. And I wanted to make sure that the medals were clearly defined, that you could really see those medals. Because the significance of that was early on, Frederick Douglass was one of the biggest recruiters for the United States colored troops, because it meant a lot for them to prove themselves as men. And part of their model was, let us get a badge upon our chest and a musket on our shoulder to prove ourselves men and equal and worthy. So that was pretty significant. So for this individual from York to have been part of this, I wanted to make sure that those medals were perfectly clear. And you guys heard of William Goodrich, the only black man in town. But he wasn't. And he was significant, and he might have been one of the more wealthy ones. He had a house, but he was not the only black man in town. But also, if you dig deeper in the research, and if you look at some of the images, there were people who would pass for white. We know that, like if you look at this image, which I think is the worst rhetorical image possible, I wanted to know, what was this painting supposed to be of this mural that you see right there on Market Street? So I actually found the artist and how they described it. So what this is supposed to be is his slave mother, him as a baby, and then him as a 10-year-old child. But when I look at this thing, it looks like he's standing there as the king of the black people, and all that context was gone. So according to the records, he was listed as mulatto, his wife was listed as black, and then his children were listed as blacks because there was a measure of that. And I wouldn't be surprised that, on some levels, he might have passed for white to acquire some of the things that he did acquire at that time. But his kids were clearly defined as being black or African American, where he was defined as being mulatto. But yeah, I like that black people. And then we get into the Northern Migration. So this is another one of the paintings from the series. This is called Running from a Crow Named Jim. So this is what black folks like, we're out of here. We're running from this Jim Crow era. And so then even the Northern Migration in itself had lots of challenges for people moving to the city, to where, yes, you were no longer working in the fields and you weren't going to be enslaved, but it also has its challenges and it introduced a lot of poverty. But the routes that people traveled from the South were clearly defined. Most of the people from Texas went to California, to the West Coast. The people from Alabama and I think it was Mississippi went to Illinois and Wisconsin. My family was from Tuskegee, Alabama. We went to Illinois. The people from the Carolinas went to Maryland and to Pennsylvania. That's why a lot of South Carolinians from the Bamberg area are here in York. And you'll notice that, so most of the black population, even today, if you were to look at the statistics, most of the black population are ringing around the borders of the United States. And that still exists. So people, when it came time to go, you grabbed what you could, you jumped on a train, you loaded everything up in the car, and you left. So again, we lost a lot of history in that exodus. It's because photographs weren't that important if you had photographs. Birth records, if you had them, weren't that important. Very often it was a Bible. Sometimes it was a tree in the backyard, which you couldn't take with you. So a lot of that stuff was lost. So when it comes to then collecting history, well, we don't have a birth certificate, we don't have this. So you don't become part of that permanent record. So even how we collect and record and document history, we're going to have to make some assumptions. I mentioned I'm a commissioner with the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission, and we're thinking about that, on the Commonwealth level. We're thinking about how are we keeping this stuff? Are we excluding people just because we have these rules that are, have these hidden bias into them? They're biased by default. Not that anybody means to, but if these are the rules and these people don't apply to the rules, are you excluding? So we have to rethink this. Some of the early work crews. As I mentioned, black folks came here, they didn't have jobs. You had to make jobs. So they were some of the early entrepreneurs. Some people were part of the conservation work crews. They were out in different areas. But very often they created jobs off of just their labor because that's what they were trained to do. Farmers, working the land, working the field, cleaning up. One of the things that Squire Braxton used to do was collect slop, old food scraps. Very often they became his dinner. One of the articles talked about how people would leave some of the extra scraps and he would take them home and he would burn the skippers out of them, which were maggots. But that's his idea of food. He got arrested once because he was so poor he would feed his horse sawdust because it's all he had, and then he got in trouble because his horse was so thin. So then they would give him extra scraps to at least be able to feed his horse. But they made a way out of no way when it came to work. But they also had really strong communities. This is one of the ledgers from the Primrose Club that was here in 1945. They had a husband and wives club. So the husbands and wives would mentor and support the young husbands and wives and teach the young wives how to cook and do these certain things, and if they had problems to counsel them, and they kept track of these sorts of things. They had a garden club, they passed out seeds, they had awards for how you kept your garden in your yard, and it was a real sense of community pride. People had home ownership, being able to buy a home and then take care of your neighborhood and your community. But if we look at the media and we look at some of the things that we commonly are used to hearing and reading about, we don't hear about these things. But to be able to look at these sorts of ledgers and see what family groups lived in this neighborhood and the sort of things they did, this is the sort of positive messaging that I think is important to line up with African American history. This was something that came out in the New York Times magazine recently, and I was having this conversation with Nicole during the break. I'm not sure if Woodard lived here, but he has family here. But they raised money here for his defense and for his support because he was beaten by a white gang and blinded. He was a military vet. And so they raised money here in York to send for that purpose, to help him. But this was in the New York Times just in 2019. And to be able to find that, I'm sitting there in a meeting and looking through this, I'm like, Woodard, I know that name. And then dig deeper and then find that connection. Then I found this newspaper article. So all it takes is a little bit of research and being able to kind of tie things together. It's like playing that game Concentration, where the cards are face down and you find a piece, and you're like, oh, I saw that someplace over here, and you find it again, all of a sudden, it's like, ah. And that's how a lot of this came together. It's just playing that concentration game and being able to keep turning these cards over, and it just gets deeper and deeper. And that's a picture of him and his mother when he was going to trial, to get these guys convicted for what they had done to him. As I mentioned, a lot of the early work was work that, they had to create work because people weren't getting jobs. So they were, they're early entrepreneurs. You created a garbage company because you picked up garbage, and then you formed and organized. This is, and nationally the story is, there's a whole chapter in American history when all of these jobs disappeared because they became municipal jobs. The very first firemen in York were African Americans because you got paid by who showed up to the fire first. So, they were the very first firemen. They were the very first garbage men. They were the very first haulers and movers. They were the very first guys who would dig up and do field work until those jobs were taken over by the municipality or somebody else who found that, hey, we can make money at this. But that's the entrepreneurial nature of a lot of the work that they ended up doing. So some of the early garbage trucks were run by African Americans here in York. And then here is some of their earlier crews. Now this photo is one of the photos that was part of the York County's, the History Center's archives. They had this photo, but they had no names attached to it. So in doing some of the interviews that I've been doing, and you'll see it on the timeline out there, we've been able to name about 10 of these guys. And I think with a few more interviews, we'll be able to know who some of them are. And they can look at it, oh, that's Mutt Orr, and that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and that's my grandfather. That's my uncle, and oh, that's me, So it adds value to it. So to have this photo in the file, that's great. To have names to it, and then be able to talk to those individuals, and have them tell stories about how they came into business, how business was, what their routes were like, that's gold. And that's what we need to do more of. These are some of the other paintings in this series. They're currently on display at the Lafayette Club. There's a whole other story I can get into with that one. But they're on the second floor of the Lafayette Club, or the Center for Community Engagement, that talks about this history and then capturing those important positive moments instead of just, oh, let's talk about emancipation, let's talk about civil rights, let's talk about Charlie Robinson. I want to talk about the stuff that happened in between, the good stuff. The image on the right is that of the beauty contest. Miss Fine Brown Frame was the name of it. And all the girls would get all dressed up, and they had categories and, poise and manners and best dressed and modeling, that sort of thing, and maybe even talent. And the women were very proud of that. But this is also a national movement. This was a movement that was kind of designed, I believe it started in Philadelphia, the Miss Fine Brown Frame, to challenge the standards of beauty. You're beautiful too. And this was getting into the young, gifted, and black movement and the Black Power movement. So to be able to touch on some of that. People have started turning over photos. So now people were hearing that I'm out here, I'm asking these questions, trying to get this information. Some people are sharing photos. Some of them will let me look at them, but couldn't touch them here. See, don't touch them. I can't give it to you, but here it is. There's a bunch of photos in the album now that you see my thumbprint where they let me hold it on a corner and take a picture of it. But I don't blame them. You know, there's trust issues, you know, and they have a lot of reasons to do so. So now what we're doing is we're scanning them, and they've got the mobile unit. They're going to go out and scan them. Keep your images, but let us tell the story. Let's not lose it for that reason. Someone was telling me a story about how after school, the kids would sit on the bench at the park and do their homework while their moms played softball. You know, this is something they did after school, you know. And then I found this photo, and you can see my thumbprint on that one now. He let me lay it on the table. I can take a picture of it, but when I found this group of these potential moms playing softball, I need to know who these women are. So maybe as interviews continue, I can get names to these individuals too and say, tell me about those after-school softball games. You know, how did you guys, why did you do this? You know, I think there's a lot of value in that kind of a story. So that work needs to continue. We always talk about the race riots, but very often we don't talk about what led up to them. You know, so this is one of the paintings, you know, that talks about the use and the constant attack with the police dogs. As you can see, the three of them going down the side. You know, the need for better jobs, better housing, better health care, transportation. That's the sort of thing that leads up to it. So rather than someone talking about, oh, let's talk about the riot, let's talk about who died, let's talk about the National Guard driving down the street. No, I want to talk about what happened before that. And then I want to talk about what happened after that. Because what happened after this, after the riots and the charrette, you know, came rapid transportation, came Community First Health, came the Community Progress Council. And that's what historically continues to happen. So we need to tell the whole story. So let's not talk about the 68, 69 riots again without talking about what led up to it, the good people who wanted a better community for themselves and their family, and then the good people that helped to make something out of it after the fact. To this day, we're still having firsts here in York. First African-American female mayor. First, you know, police detective and district magistrate just a few years ago. You know, here we are, well into the 2000s, and we're still having firsts. But there were people who were doing some other things. And we have Maddie Chapman on the wall, who is the prothonotary. But we don't always talk about those. But the fact that we're still having these firsts here in York is still pretty significant. First deputy chief for the fire department. So we have to get to the point where we're not having these firsts, then we have to like make note of it. Oh, that's the first black person to do this. It needs to be more commonplace. It needs to be, there's yet another qualified individual doing this job, not that we just have another first. Why this is important, as I mentioned before, because we're losing these records. You know, that big photo album with all those great photos that nobody remembers the names for, you know, that are upstairs in grandma's attic. You know, they're selling the house. Nobody wants to take that big old dusty album because if it's not on my phone, I don't want anything to do with it. You know, we're losing that stuff. You can go on eBay and find box loads of these images. So I'm always encouraging people to share their stories, share their images, put them someplace so that 3 generations from now, your great-great-great-grandkids, if they want to know, oh, I heard a story about, you know, my great-great-grandpa who was a preacher at this church and he started this, you know, this food bank group. Tell me more about that. And like, oh, I don't know, we used to have, no, go to the history set, it'll be there. So we don't have to sit there again and say, I did not know that. Because there's absolutely no reason for us to say we did not know that. So I encourage every family in York, especially the ones who've been from multiple generations, you should have a box, a family box and folder in that archive, you know, in that library with your family story, with your family images. It could be a disc, it could be a thumb drive, whatever it is, but there's no reason for us to have to go back and see what happened. You know, there might be, oh, we have a family historian, they're in charge of all of that. What if they have a house fire? Who's in charge of it now? It's gone. So it's extremely important to keep track of those things. You know, images like these two. Now, I think we found out who this couple was, but I think it was like they worked for this dry cleaner for like 15, 20 years. You know, reliable employees, and it still goes forward. Or did you want to go back to that?
Yeah.
Oh.
Thanks. Thanks.
So this is one of the paintings that was from the Casting Shadows series. So this is Bernice Chilton, and she's over here on our timeline. She just turned 101, I believe. She's lived here in York since she was 2 years old. She's very proud to have been able to vote for her first African-American president. Very proud to have just voted in the 2020 election. And she has 5 generations of her family here in York. You know, so it was really wonderful. So they were so happy. So I said, well, let's all get together and take this family picture. They were happy to get together and take this family picture while Nana was still here. Nana was able to be in those pictures because very often the only time you get together with these things is, you know, at Nana's funeral. So now they have these images. And they say, oh, that's Nana, that's my cousin. So some of the cousins hadn't seen each other in a very, very long time. It was supposed to be like a little 1-hour photo shoot. I think we were there for 5 hours. I think I had to bring in food because they didn't want to leave because they were having this wonderful time sharing these stories. And, you know, and Nana was sitting there telling them about, you know, their uncle this and their great-grandfather. And they were just enthralled. And we need to do more of that sort of thing. And at the same time, I'm sitting there taking notes because it's going to be part of the story. It's going to go somewhere in those archives. And then we have young folks. I'm extremely proud of the young folks now that are like, you know, stepping up and making sure that we don't step backwards, keeping track of, you know, these stories and moving the needle forward. So that, because we always, again, get lulled into complacency. You know, we get a movement, everything's going to happen, and then it goes back down. And again, like I said, you can see it. We went from the 60s to the 70s, things get real thin, real thin. You get Black Lives Matter, things gets a little bit big again. But that's not how history happens. It's consistent. But we need to be more sustainable about how we're keeping track and how things continue to progress. Oh, there's a little sun. Oh. Okay. Even with the cemeteries, you know, a lot of our rich history is in the cemeteries. We have an incredible group, the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery, you know, headed by Sam Durham and Tina Charles, who are doing a great job of uncovering these markers and then pulling up, and they're out there doing a lot of research, you know, finding out who these people are, what they did. And that's another part that we have to make sure that we're doing. As far as the Commonwealth is concerned, we're trying to figure out and establish some rules that every African-American cemetery, and most of them are segregated cemeteries, are part of a public record. Whether they are currently a parking lot or a parking garage and no longer exist, and all they were able to find is a couple little stones and a couple of old plants, that we mark those as being of a historic record. You know, there are things that, like, you can tell that you're in an area of a black cemetery by the foliage, because they planted a lot of lilies, the little lily bells, and the sword plants, because it was part of an African tradition. So if you are in the woods and you find an area with a bunch of sword plants and a bunch of lilies, you're possibly on an African-American cemetery. So we need to go through and start marking those things, and then somebody says, I think this is potential, and start digging up and doing some research. And then those things are going to be, you know, part of the Commonwealth's record. You know, they're digging, I mean, the ladies are doing an incredible job over there at Lebanon, you know, making sure that no one's stone is sinking under and making sure all those records are found. And they find a grave marker, and they're doing a research. They're pulling up the articles and like, oh, this is so-and-so, and making that connection, you know, between those different families. So I talked about how things, you know, there's progress, you know, things get bigger, things get smaller. So long as they keep showing up, I think that's what's really important. But my biggest concern right now is that we're keeping track of the stuff that has already happened, that we're going back and capturing the stories so that we don't lose them, and that we have those oral histories and tell those stories, especially from our older folks, before they're gone and they can't tell us those stories anymore. So I can't go through everything here on the timeline, but I hope you guys take the time. And again, this isn't everything. We're asking people, we've even got Postit Notes. If you have something you want to add to it, you know, like, oh, I knew this person, or I might know somebody who can add to that story, let us know. Put it on the Postit Note so we can, like, then, you know, play concentration and find another piece and flip over another card to be able to keep putting this together to capture those things. And as you go through, you'll see, you know, there's some national things on there that might talk about, there's a few like national items that you'll see progress or what might have changed that will have affected, local history. We had lots, there was so many things that we couldn't include just for the lack of space without it being overcrowded. But if you, just think about where things were moving, what was happening nationally, and what was just happening in general. And I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you enjoy looking at the timeline and all of the things that happened throughout your county and throughout our nation and how it all fits. And I hope that you will all play a role in us saving these stories going forward so that we don't have to keep saying, I did not know that. Thank you. Now you know a lot. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.